God is love. whatsoever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Then he warned the disciples that they should tell no one that he was the Christ.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Now, here's the argument. The rock is Peter. Peter is the rock upon whom Jesus builds his church. Now, I've got two problems with the argument. Maybe you've got one. What would you say is a problem with that? Tony, go ahead.
Well, the Greek word, I think, is petros. It just means stone. And so what I think is obvious to me that he's talking about his confession. That's the stone of belief in Jesus Christ.
I think that's right.
It's the
Yeah.
rock.
That's true. There is a Greek. I think I may have this on the worksheet. Do I have it on the worksheet?
Yeah.
Okay, so you've got a couple of Greek words there. Basically this, Petros is a masculine, and it means something like a stone, maybe even a pebble. But then he uses a feminine, which is Petra, which is something more like upon this rock, and he uses a feminine, different word in the Greek text, which means something like a cliff or a mountain or a ledge, something much bigger than a pebble or a stone. And he says upon this, not the name Petros, but upon this rock, Petra, feminine form, I'll build my church. And he uses something much bigger than just little Peter. So maybe there's an argument to be said about that. There's a second thing. Remember we were in Daniel class on Sunday morning? Well, at least some of us were. And we talked about all those stone prophecies of the Old Testament. Who is the stone? So says the New Testament as it develops. It's Jesus Christ. Why somebody get for us 1 Corinthians 3 and verse 11? To say that the church is built upon Peter as though he's the first pope certainly is not being said by Matthew 16. I mean, just to go that far, it's just certainly not being stated by Matthew 16. But somebody get for us 1 Corinthians 3:11. Who's got it and would like to read? Tony, go ahead.
For no man laid a foundation other than the one which is laid, which is Jesus Christ.
There you go. The foundation is who? Jesus Christ. Now, I admit, Ephesians 2 says that upon Jesus Christ was laid the layer, not of just Peter though, of the apostles. But then it even goes on to say that you and I build onto this foundation too. 1 Corinthians 3, Ephesians chapter 2. So to say that Peter is somehow singled out as being, because he has some kind of prominence in the New Testament, he must be the first pope, it's just not being even stated by the New Testament. I need to give us a passage here, but Caleb's got a point. Caleb, go ahead.
They also contradict their own tradition, because according to Catholicism, the Pope is not allowed to marry, where Scripture clearly says Peter has a mother-in-law. You can't have a mother-in-law unless you're married.
So let's get into that here in a bit. That edict comes around in AD 1034. So it's about 1,000 years later that that kind of thing develops in Roman Catholicism, but you're exactly right. You're exactly right. We'll come back to that. Anything else?
Yeah. Peter was rock. He denied Jesus. That doesn't sound very rock-like to me. And then later on, when the Hebrews come around, he backed off what he was doing before and tried to please them. That's not.
Again, like with Caleb. Let's get to that here in a second. That's a great point. That's a very good point, though. Very good point, Norman. So yeah, the rock is probably, like Tony said, it's probably the confession of Jesus, about Jesus, that is, by Peter. Upon the confession, you are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. That's the foundation. That's the basis upon which the New Testament church is founded. Think about if you take that claim away. If Jesus isn't the Messiah, the Son of God, does Christianity get off the ground? No, any other view is a non-starter. That's not going to go. So when we think about Peter being the first pope, if we go to Matthew 16, this is the only argument we've analyzed yet. If we go to Matthew 16, it's just not stated there. You should note this as well. The word pope, even a Greek equivalent, is not in the New Testament, whatever that's worth. Greg, go ahead.
Well, when you look at verse 18, even the way it's worded, when it says on this rock, it was Peter would have said on you. I mean, even the wordage doesn't even fit.
Good point. Good point. Why does he kind of like toggle off of Peter onto something else? That's a good point, yeah. Anything else? Okay, so let's take a look at a second thing here, and that is they try to note his prominence in the early church. Go over to Galatians 2. Look at this for just a second. In Galatians chapter 2. Interesting little phrase here. There's a lot to be said about Galatians, of course. I'm thinking, let me give you this. I may have said this earlier on. I don't remember. I know I argued it when we took Acts together, but how recent since then, I'm not real sure. As far as I can tell, Acts 15 is Galatians chapter 2. Now, does anybody remember what we title Acts 15? You might have a heading there. The Jerusalem Conference. 15:1 starts out, except you come down. It says some of them were coming down saying, except you be circumcised after the manner of Moses, you cannot be saved. Well, Galatians 2 is happening the same way. In Acts 15, they start out at Jerusalem, and the troop ends up in Antioch. You'll have looked at Galatians 2 and verse 1. Where are they? Jerusalem. You get down to about 2 verse 11. I think the next unit starts. Where are they in 2:11? Antioch. If it's not 2:11, it's around there somewhere. So it's the same deal is what I'm saying. The dispute in Acts 15 is about whether or not you can be saved with or without circumcision. The dispute in Galatians 2 is the same dispute. It's the same people in Acts 15 that are gathered for this conference. In Galatians chapter 2, it's the same people that are gathered for the conference. Then it's the same troop that makes its way to Antioch, same troop that makes its way to Antioch. The chronology lines up as far as I can tell, and there are some big hitters who disagree with me on this, but for the life of me, I can't work their view out. I'm convinced that Galatians 2 and Acts 15 are saying the same thing. Why is that important? The dispute here is about circumcision. And we'll come back to Galatians 2 to talk about this in a second. Well, actually, this is it. If you look at Galatians chapter 2 and verse 9, it does call these fellows who come to Jerusalem James and Cephas. Who is Cephas? Peter. Simon Peter, also known as Cephas. What does the word Cephas mean? Rock. Interestingly enough, it means rock. So then you've got James and Peter and John, who are reputed to be, what does it call them in 2:9? Pillars. Something of big hitters in the New Testament church. These were founders, more or less. You don't want to go that way and say that they founded the church, but they founded the church, if you get what I mean. Use my vernacular, you understand what I'm saying. The point I'm making is that Peter was something of prominence in the New Testament church. That's not to be disputed. If you back up even to 2:7, look at Galatians 2:7. Paul says on Galatians 2:7 that I, Paul, had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, Gentiles, just as Peter had been to the circumcised, the Jews. So there's no disputing that Peter is of some kind of prominence. But would that say that he is the Pope? Certainly not. It just doesn't go that way. But then, like Norman pointed out for us, in Galatians chapter 2, look at what happens in 11 through 14. Look at what happens in 11 through 14. When Cephas, Peter, came to Antioch, same thing that's happening in Acts 15. I opposed him to his face, Paul says, because he stood condemned. For, verse 12, prior to the coming of certain men from James, that is from Jerusalem, some of these circumcised Jews want to press circumcision even on the Gentiles as like a door into the kingdom of God. He used to eat with the Gentiles. If they had a party, a fellowship meal, a banquet, a buffet, they all gathered at the same table, and Peter was sitting right there with Cornelius and the other buddies. Well, an interesting thing happens. Look at this in 2:12. But when they came from James, these Jews that are binding circumcision, he began to withdraw, and he stepped out of the table and held himself aloof, fearing the party of the circumcision. Doesn't look good. Well, it gets worse. Look at 2:13. The rest of the Jews joined him in hypocrisy, with the result that even Barnabas, the son of consolation, the encourager, the one who got Paul in the door, Acts 9, 27 to 29. Barnabas, the one who got Paul a foot in the door, people were suspicious of Paul. Barnabas said, no, let's trust him. He belongs in the kingdom. Barnabas, too, is carried away by their hypocrisy. 2:14. Now, Paul, if we didn't think he had a backbone when he was killing Christians, we know that the backbone that he had then carried over even into the way he acted in the New Testament church because of what happens in 2:14. I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel. I said to Peter, a big hitter, in the presence of them all, if you, Peter, being a Jew, live like the Gentiles and not like the Jews, how is it that you compel the Gentiles to live like the Jews? Now, there's a lot going underneath the text of Galatians. There's a lot going on. Look at one more passage with me. Who wants to read Galatians 6, 12, and 13? And then I'll try to explain some of what's going on. Who's got Galatians 6, 12, and 13? Logan, go right ahead.
Those who desire to make a good showing in the flesh try to compel you to be circumcised, simply so that they will not be persecuted for the cross of Christ. For those who are circumcised do not even keep the law themselves, but they desire to have you circumcised so that they may boast in your flesh.
Okay, this is going to take a second. Follow with me. You pay your money now, it'll pay off in the end. Okay, you've got two major institutions. Rome is the big one. Rome is in power. And imperial Rome has idols everywhere. You serve Caesar and you serve the pagan gods. Everybody does it. It's just how it goes. Well, they found out early on when Rome took off, they found out real early on, you're not going to convince these Jews to give up Jehovah God. You can kill them. You can put them in the Colosseum. Doesn't matter what you do with them. The Colosseum comes a little bit later on, but you get the idea. And they found out more or less you won't get the Jews to recant. They're going to believe in their Jehovah God. And so what they got as an idea was instead of forcing them to conform to becoming idolatrous, what we need to do is just make a pact with the Jews and give them a pass. We'll give the Jews a pass. And the New Testament bears this out. You look at Acts chapter 18, you look at the whole book of Acts and it bears this out. Rome says the Jews get a pass. Now something happens that's a world changer here. This Jewish boy, Jesus, goes and dies on a cross. And the whole thing gets changed. Now you've got about three things that are going on. You've got three different groups here. You've got the Jews after the cross of Jesus who are non-believers. They're not pagans, but they're not going to get persecution from Rome. They get a pass. You've got a second group of individuals. They are believers. But about the old law, let's hold that in question for a moment. And then you've got a third group of believers like, let's say, Paul. Now, here's the difference between these three groups. These are Jews. All three of these groups are Jewish. This group here doesn't believe in Jesus as the Messiah. So they're not under suspicion from Rome yet. The second group are Jewish believers. They're Jewish believers. So they're Jewish believers. But what they start pressing, because Paul says Gentiles can come into the family of God, not through circumcision, but through some kind of new system. Let's just work at it as that. It's a new system. These fellows in the middle are kind of caught in the crossfire. If we go the way of Paul and say that Gentiles can come into the family of God as Gentiles, we're going to take heat from these fellows and from Rome. And so they're right in the middle. You know what they do? They compromise. What if we can somehow, they're thinking politically, what if we can merge our ethnic national hopes with this new thing called gospel? And we can kind of bring the two together. We're not going to throw out baptism, but we're not going to throw out circumcision either. That looks an awful lot like what's going on in Acts 15, Galatians chapter 2, don't you think? Well, here's what they do. They say, let's compromise. And we'll say that in order to be Christian, you've got to be circumcised after the manner of Moses. You've got to proselytize, just like the Old Testament Gentiles would have had to have done as whole. And so here in the middle, you've got this group saying, let's compromise. And guess what Peter starts to do? In Galatians chapter 2, he starts to play the way of the compromiser. Interestingly enough, back in Acts 10 and 11, who was it that converted the first Gentile? Peter. Who was the first Gentile convert? Cornelius. Peter's the one who gets the Gentiles in the door. The pressure starts to come. Peter backs off of it. It says in 2:12 through 14 of Galatians, when certain came from James, he stepped back from the table with the Gentiles who had not been circumcised. Paul wouldn't permit them to be circumcised. So said 2:3 through 5. And it says in Galatians chapter 2:12 through 14, Peter starts to withdraw from the table, and he plays the same kind of compromise that these believers, Christians, were trying to play by merging the two. Now this group, spoken of in Galatians 6:12 and 13, they're not thinking about God. They're thinking about a political agenda, and they're only thinking about swimming with their heads, keeping it above water, as they've made this pact with Rome to get a pass. But if you get this new group from Paul, also incorporating Gentiles without circumcision, they don't look like Jews, they don't seem like Jews, all of a sudden you're just going to start getting the eye of Rome headed your way. And this is exactly what leads into the affair of AD 70, causing the temple to be flattened. They get too much attention going on. And Rome looks their way and says, let's go flatten that city, Jerusalem, and give them what they deserve. Now, in Galatians chapter 2, Peter comes on as a compromiser. Why is that important? Well, here's the argument. Long argument, but it's a good one. I would have thought that the vicar of Christ wouldn't have done such a thing. Do you think that? If this is the person of God embodied in a pope, I would have thought that we wouldn't have such a mistake. Much less the episode of Matthew chapter 27 where he's caught denying Jesus. Matthew 26. So you've got some problems. If you've got Peter having human fallibility, that raises a question right out of the gate as to whether or not he's fit to be what is called the vicar of Christ. Okay, anything on that? Any questions or any comments on that? Logan, go ahead, and then Tony.
Just a sidetrack. How did they know, like you have Paul and then you got Peter saying two different things, like if you're just in that time, how did they know which one to actually believe? Did Jesus already say something on it and I missed that? Or were they trying to figure it out?
So you're talking about in the controversy of Galatians 2?
Right.
Okay, so that's a really good question, a really tough question. It doesn't say, for whatever it's worth, it doesn't say explicitly, but I would have thought a couple of things. First of all, according to Galatians 2, Peter doesn't kick back with any kind of response and say, Paul's actually in the wrong. That would be one big thing. The second thing is, like we pointed out, Peter's the one who gets the Gentiles in the door without circumcision in the first place, Acts chapter 10. So you've got some things there that already are exposing Peter. It becomes very obvious in Galatians 2, he's just compromising. Does that make sense? He's not really making an argument. He's not even making a defense. He's just in the wrong.
Gotcha.
So even if people try to go the way of Peter, it looks like to me, Peter's not even pushing this stuff aggressively. He's just buckling under the weight of pressure.
Yeah, I guess it's just in that time, like communication and stuff would have been totally different. So it's not like on social media where everyone's watching this go down. So it's
Yeah.
like people are trying to figure out, oh, which is actually the way I'm supposed to be going. If you have Peter doing this and then Paul doing that, you know.
Which is what I think really grinds Paul's gears when he sees Barnabas going the way of Peter. And he says, you know, not only is Peter compromising, he's pulling others astray. And that's why he does stand up publicly and say, I've had it with this. You know, I think that's a big thing there in the text that he even gets on Barnabas' case. Anything else? Tony had something.
Yeah, the non-believers, I think they were compromising probably, but probably they compromised the least of the three groups, in my opinion, because they never, and to this day, you have that group of non-believers that deny Jesus Christ. They still exist. So, you know, I see where there is a compromise between those three groups, but I'm just simply saying that the non-believers, in my opinion, sacrifice the very least out of the three groups.
Good. So let's think about this for just a second and then we'll move off of it. If you were a non-believer, well, let's do it even if you came from a denominational background or you've got friends or family in denominational backgrounds. What are some of the reasons that people say, I'm not converting to Christ? What are some of the reasons? Any of the reasons? Always done it this way. So tradition. These would be some of the reasons that they might. Tradition. Family. Peer pressure. So here's my point, just quickly. The non-believing group would have even branched out a number of different people that are doing things for certain reasons. Look at one passage with me, John 12, 42 and 43. Who wants to read John 12, 42 and 43? Here are some believers, but they're not going to go the way because of, like, I think it was Greg that just said peer pressure. It's going to push them another way. Greg, if you've got it, go ahead. John 12, 42 and 43.
Nevertheless, even among the rulers, many believed in him, but because of the Pharisees, they did not confess it, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. They loved the praise of men more than the praise of God.
So that's one of these types right here. Because of the pressure, because we'll be put out of the synagogue, because of fear, we're just not going to go the way, but we do believe that Jesus is the Messiah. Can you beat that? But there would be people who would be saying, I just don't see he's the Messiah. I just don't see it. And that's another cast within this group of the non-believers. Does that make sense? So you've got people who go different ways for different reasons, is what I'm arguing. Tony, go ahead.
No, I mean the non-believers, the Jews as they are today that don't believe in Jesus Christ as the Messiah, they still believe in the law, don't they?
Yes, yeah.
I mean, the New Testament means
nothing to them, yeah. In fact, it's very heretical is what they'd have to say and do say. You guys know Ben Shapiro, right? So he's a professing Jew. I mean, he's ethnically a Jew, but he also professes that to be his faith. Nowhere close to consistent, by the way, I should tell you. I'm not trying to be rude with this remark, it's just a fact. The Jews aren't even close to law abiding, if you know what I mean. Do you realize if you go back to the Old Testament and try to keep that law, that you're going to get yourself tied up in a knot real quick? You can't do more than a Sabbath day's journey. You know that's just over a mile. You're no traveling on Saturday, more or less, for you. I mean, if you're under it, you're under it. And that's Paul's argument in Galatians. He says something like that in Galatians 5:3. You're under the law, you're under the law. But nonetheless, the Jews today just aren't keeping it. Not even close.
Maybe they even prove their genealogy back to being a Jew, which was very necessary during the Old Testament.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. Ezra too. That's right.
Do you remember the article on rabbinic Judaism that I sent you?
I do.
That actually goes through, it becomes more of a religion based on tradition rather than religion based on scripture. So in that aspect, modern Judaism is more aligned to Catholicism
Very much so, yeah.
than it is to scripture.
Very much so. And Jesus guts them for that kind of development already in Matthew 15. Why are you keeping the tradition rather than the law of God? Matthew 15:3. Doesn't he say something like that? Oh, he does. You look it up in your own time. 15:3 of Matthew. Okay, take a look at this next one. Number C, letter C. Andy, if he were here, he'd correct me. Letter C. By insisting that there needs to be a head of the church. Who's the head of the church? You tell me. Christ. Do we have a passage for it?
Ephesians 1:22-23.
Somebody get that. Ephesians 1:22 and 23. Caleb, if you've got it, you just go right ahead. Go ahead. Ephesians 1, you need to know this one. Your Catholic buddies need to be reminded of this one. Ephesians 1:22 and 23.
Yeah. And hath put all things under his feet, and gave him to be the head over all things to the church, which is his body, the fullness of him, and fill all in all.
Excellent. Good you remember that, Caleb. If there's a head of the church, and there is, his name is Jesus. It is not a pope. It is not another fallible human being. This is Jesus. This is not a pope, as the Roman Catholic Church sets it up. And then this last one, the Roman Catholic Church tries to suggest that Peter was the first pope by suggesting that Peter was present in Rome. I'll say this. I personally don't have a problem if he were in Rome. Being able to prove that is another thing, but even if he were, it doesn't prove what they're needing it to prove. So look at one text with me. Look at 1 Peter 5, and I'll show you where the argument comes from. I don't even know that I disagree with the Roman Catholic view on this passage, but like I said, even if I don't, it wouldn't give them what they're needing. They're needing a whole papal system. That's not proven by saying, oh, Peter showed up in Rome one day. So look at 1 Peter 5:13. Who's got it and wants to read it? Randy, go right ahead. 1 Peter 5:13.
The church that is at Babylon, elect together with you, saluteth you, and so doth Marcus, my son.
Two things there that are very interesting. The first one is that he says Mark. Is that John Mark? Perhaps. I mean, Marcus was somewhat of a common name, but it could have been John Mark. If you've got John Mark there, tradition has it, generally we think that Mark writes his gospel around the Roman city with a Gentile background. So if that's true, and Mark is there, this would support the next thing I'm about to say. And the second thing then is this. It's the church at Babylon. Certainly that's not literal Babylon, I wouldn't think. That's a very distant land, unmentioned elsewhere in the New Testament. Who do you think in the book of Revelation the beast is? It's Babylon. It says it explicitly, Babylon. Who do you think the villain is in the book of Revelation? Rome. Calls Rome Babylon a number of times. Revelation 17 and 18. Babylon the Great. Babylon the harlot. Babylon was fallen. A number of times. Revelation 17 and 18. If it is a cryptic reference to Rome, what if Peter's saying, she, the church, that is at Rome, and Babylon is a term with all of the trappings of a harlotress. Either way, a prostituting city. There we go. I got it right finally. No, prostituting city. If that's true, then he's using a dig to say, this Roman junk is just full of rot. Well, in 1 Peter 5:13, I kind of go that way and wonder if Babylon is a reference to Rome. I know some who really oppose that. Look, folks, if it is Rome, just because Peter's there doesn't even come close to proving he's the first pope. So we don't have a problem there. Had one guy, he was from the older generation, and probably faced Roman Catholicism than I ever have. But he was really staunch. This could have no reference to Rome because he thought that we were giving the Catholics way too much if we said Peter ever set foot in the Roman city. I just don't see a problem with that. I just don't see a problem with that. If he did, he did. If he didn't, he didn't. Either way, it's not going to prove everything that the Roman Catholics are saying about Peter as Pope. Seth and then Hannah. Seth, go ahead.
So I think it's interesting. So you have the Catholics and they have the Pope, or you have the people created by God, and then they create this position that they claim to have the power of God. I find it similar, not necessarily in the specific idea, but in the method of how they shift focus on with idols, because they created by God, and then they create something that they claim created them.
Yeah.
They have, not that it's exactly the same way, but that how they have a position created by a creator, and then the created choose the creator is actually something else that they created.
It's very idolatrous. How many, show of hands, how many of you have somebody close, if you know your second cousin, twice removed, whatever, don't go that way this with me, but how many of you have close friends that are Roman Catholic? Not many of us. I don't. I probably need to get out into the world a bit more. I had some relatives who had some relatives that had Catholic as their background. But from what I hear, they treated that system like about as idolatrous as you could get. This one woman had her little, you can't remember the make model, it was Chevrolet, some little Chevrolet car, something like an Impala or something. And she had a little crucifix there in the dash. And that was the cross of Christ as far as she was concerned. You know what I mean? And there was this one time, I'm told by them, she got in a wreck and she swore up and down the crucifix saved her. So if you can beat that, mine. Okay, Hannah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's about as sensible as saying, like, because I was in Washington, D.C., I was the president.
Yeah.
Just because you're in a location doesn't make you something.
Well, for my political joke of the night, it's getting to be about that bad. Okay, let's take a look at this then. Did the idea of the papacy develop over several years because of an abuse of eldership / leadership? It did. It certainly did. And was Gregory the First the official pope? He was. There is no link, I should tell you. I'm pointing to the board like I'm pointing at something. Not up there what I need to have up here. Chronologically speaking, there is no link from the 1st century to 600. There's just no tie all the way from Gregory. Sorry, Greg.
He's not a Gregory.
Okay. He's not a Gregory, just a Greg. But 2 G's. 2 G's. From 600 all the way back to Peter, there's just no link there. Just no link there. So they've tried to do some excavation to basically make that plausible. You read it on your own time. I don't want to sift through any of that. It's just not there. The evidence is just not there. Now, Norman, did you have a point?
No.
Oh, okay. This was Caleb's point a moment ago. Don't you find it interesting? They come out with this edict, 1074, I think I said 34 a bit ago, basically pushing celibacy onto the papal guild. Now here's going to be their comeback. If you say, well, I find it interesting that, Peter had a mother-in-law. Anybody know the passage? Okay, let's get it then. Matthew 8:14. Somebody get for us Matthew 8:14. We need to know this one on this point. Whoever's got Matthew 8:14 first, just go right ahead and read it for us. Matthew 8 and verse 14.
When Jesus came into Peter's home, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick in bed with a fever.
There you have it. If you've got a mother-in-law, what's that mean? Look at that. We know how to do implication in this class. Woo! He's got a wife. He's got a wife. And so, Peter, here's what your Catholic buddies are going to tell you. He was married, but our edict, that doesn't come along until later. The push for celibacy is until later. But I'm raising the question, why does this ever come about in the first place? Does this make the Pope more holy? Let's say it does. Let's say it doesn't. Either way, I'm curious. Why is the edict there? If it does make him more holy, you're going to be more holy than Pope Peter? No, that's going to be a tough sell. He's the first Pope. Norman, go ahead.
My view is it made them pedophiles, molesting little boys.
I'm not disagreeing with you.
Yes.
I'm not disagreeing with you.
And there's also a verse, I can't remember, it says, forbidden to marry and eat meat is a doctrine of death.
Let's get that one too. Somebody get for us 1 Timothy 4. Flip over to 1 Timothy 4. 1 through 3. Whoever's got it. 1 Timothy 4, 1 through 3.
But the Spirit explicitly says that in the latter times they will fall away from the faith, paying attention to deceitful spirits and doctrines of demons, by means of the hypocrisy of liars, seared in their own conscience as a branded iron. Men who forbid marriage and advocate abstaining from foods which God has created to be gratefully shared in by those who believe and know the truth. For everything.
Yeah, that's good, Derek. Thank you. He calls it a doctrine of demons to forbid marriage. I find that interesting. 1 Timothy 4:1, 1 Timothy 4:3. Take a look at 2 Timothy 3. 2 Timothy 3. Doesn't say the same thing, but Paul's writing the same kind of discussion here. I'll read this one quite quickly. 3:1 of 2 Timothy. Realize this, in the last days difficult times will come. Men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy. This is 3:3. Unloving, irreconcilable, malicious gossips, without self-control, brutal, haters of good. Verse 4, treacherous, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. And he says in 3:5, holding to a form of godliness, although they have denied its power, avoid such men as these. Now, he doesn't say, as he back did in 1 Timothy 4, 1 through 3, about the not married, but it's the same kind of list, you'll notice. And in the same kind of list, he concludes and says, this is not even a form of godliness. It's a form of godliness. They claim religion, but this is not even on track, not even closely on track. And he says, from such men like this, you stay away from. So I find it interesting. That's a good point, Norman. I find it interesting that, first of all, Peter is married. So whatever goes on in 1074 as coming out with this edict from the papal system then to say that we should promote celibacy is undercutting Peter, first and foremost. But then the second thing is it's undercutting the biblical text. But then if you're a Catholic, we know what you say. Well, the church is authoritative anyway, and we have the right to rework the Constitution of the Bible. You know, that's how you go at it. So that's how it goes. Caleb, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the scripture here should have been their first warning when they were doing this about how bad it is. But secondly as well, they're undermining something that God has created for us to enjoy. Like, ever since the beginning of time, God said marriage is a good thing. And the Catholics are going to go out and say that, oh, well, if you don't marry, you obtain this office, then you're so much more holy than the rest. When God would argue that being married makes you holy, not more holy than the people who are single, but it helps you be holy because you have a partner helping you through life.
Yeah. Think about, you guys know the passage, Hebrews 13:4. Anybody quote it? Well, maybe not then. There you go. Marriage is undefiled, bed undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge. I was reading Harold Attridge, Yale New Testament professor. Nothing real great about this line except for that it's really good. And he said something like this. He said, did you know that marriage cuts against the grain of this old oppressive world? I never looked at it that way. But you know, if you're a family man, you're kind of saying to the devil and everything that this world wants to push the other way, you kind of say, you know, I'm not on your team. By being a family man, can you beat that? Look around who's saving the world, folks. It's not the people who are against the family. It's the family man. You want to be great today? Be a family man. Why? Because I am? No. But I'm trying to be great because I want to be a family man. You know, those two things kind of go together. The people in the first century were family men. I mean, even the ones that were unmarried were still committed to the idea of family. Paul is the one who's unmarried, and guess what? He's writing about family an awful lot, isn't he? Guess where the institution comes from? It comes from God. He was the one who gave the woman, contrary to what some of us men might say. Isn't that right? He gave us the woman. And we're supposed to leave and cleave, and we're supposed to, you get the rest of it. Genesis 1 through 11 is paramount to who we are as a people. And you know who's cutting against that grain? The world. The world wants to undercut the family. That's really the way it goes. Justin, go ahead.
It's so valuable for developing men to becoming leaders that it is required to become a leader in the church as an elder.
Excellent point.
And then they just strip that away.
That's very, very interesting, isn't it? One of the things required of elders is to have a wife. That's the point Norman was getting ready to make. And Roman Catholic says it exactly the other way. No wives here. Wow. And think about how the family does develop you. Men, you don't need to answer, but if you do, that's okay. How many of you have changed because of your spouse? Eric's got 2 hands up. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's a great thing.
That's not good, it's great.
Okay.
Yeah, she's sitting there.
I would say
Change
I'm glad I'm moving here.
Yeah, that could, I don't know. Anyway, how many of you have kids and you'd say my kids change? Yeah, your kids change it too. Almost like that's needed for the elder for good reason.
The celibacy part, though, I think what the Catholics were trying to do was to supersede that and go all the way back to Christ. I think, closer to God. I think that's the way I've heard it said before, is that it even supersedes Peter, and they're trying to go all the way back to Christ, saying that he never took a life. He never,
Okay, so that could be, there were a couple of other groups in the New Testament you need to look up about the Essenes, Essenes, and then also there were the Qumran fellows, the Dead Sea Scroll guys, the ones who did all the writing on that. They were the community at Qumran right there around the Dead Sea. And they kind of had those same kind of mantras too. No wives here, no women allowed, no girls allowed. Isn't that what Little Rascal said? No girls allowed. Something like that was on their club door. Anyway, so here these fellows are doing the same kind of thing, same kind of mindset, but it's just interesting that the New Testament cuts right against that grain. It says, no, this is not right. So, but again, if you're a Roman Catholic, or if you are of the Essenes, or you are of the Qumran fellows, you're just simply going to say the New Testament scriptures are not our scriptures. And if you're a Roman Catholic, you're going to say there are scriptures, but only as much as the church allows us to say they are. Now, I heard a fellow Roman Catholic say that in a debate, by the way, so I'm not making this stuff up. I thought I had one more point there, but maybe not. Okay, how much time do we have? 1 minute. Well, this is aggressive. Okay, so we better stop there. Anybody have a last killer line for us? Justin does. Go ahead.
I find it interesting that we're going all the way back to the beginning here. That if they call Peter the Pope, who is the stone, Peter dies.
Yeah.
If you build your everlasting church on a guy that dies, I don't know how that becomes everlasting.
Yeah. And again, the only reason that this would ever become a suggestion is because of an agenda rather than biblical truth. Remember, it's easy to read the text and say Jesus is the one upon whom the church is built. But if you've got an agenda to prove, well, we've got to rework some stuff. Caleb, last thing.
You mentioned it earlier, and it helped remember something that I saw that really resonated with me. This guy, he said, you might know his name is Nick Freitas. He's not talking about what he said. Anyway, he said, we live in a culture that is pushing against marriage because you know the type of people who are easy to target and manipulate? People who are not married, because they don't have partners to help push them forward. They don't have children to take care of and make sure they're living good lives. And so not that the people who aren't married aren't going to make it as Christians, but it's a lot harder to shape a family that is built around marriage, around things that are supposed to look.
Yeah, good point. Paul said it this way: Jew, Gentile, male, female, slave, non-slave, slave or master. Any of those, he even says in 1 Corinthians 7, married or unmarried, doesn't matter. Get to heaven, you can do work for Christ. Thanks for being here. God bless you. Good to see each of you again.